Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for attending this session. This is going to be a session that's different in many different respects from the other presentations. It'll focus primarily on looking at the stimulus in the context of all the stimulus that has been administered up until this point, but also looking at what the future stimulus could look like and how that will impact consumers, how that will impact inflation, and some of the things to think about as as you guys are dealing with consumers and looking at how consumers' pocketbooks will likely be affected over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and even potentially 10 years. So I think this is a topic that doesn't get a lot of attention, and so I'm really excited to share this with you guys here. So let's get started. So the current Biden stimulus, the one that just got passed in March, it was as you all know, it's $1.9 trillion, the American Rescue Plan. And so, one of the things, to think about is, most consumers, they've gotten 3 different checks, right? And I'll kind of enlarge the screen so you guys could see it. They've gotten three different stimulus checks. One was back in March of 2020. It's the COVID-19 relief package. They also got one in December, and the third one, just as I mentioned, was back in March of 2021. And so this 1.9 trillion, I think many of you have heard it in the news. It's almost as if the media has been covering it so much that when you kind of think about the magnitude of the stimulus, it's like, okay, there's 2 trillion here, there's a 1 trillion there, there's another 2 trillion. And so I think what it's important to recognize is that this type of stimulus is unprecedented in U.S. history. And if you kind of look back, during the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, that was 800 billion, right? And if many of you will recall that even having that sort of stimulus implemented, it took a significant amount of effort, by Congress, by the Treasury, by the Federal Reserve, and so the 3 latest stimulus that we've seen, it dwarfs the 800 billion. And so many, I think it's important to recognize that the stimulus, it's great. It's something that consumers needed because of the highly restrictive policies that governments and states across the United States have implemented, right? And so I do recognize that there is a need because many folks have lost jobs, right? And this government stimulus has been crucial in making sure that consumers and workers would be able to get enough funds to support their own families and purchase the food items that they need to not only survive but also provide for their families as well. So up until this point, there's been $4 trillion of stimulus. If many of you have heard, listened to Biden's recent address, there's a potential, an additional $4 trillion that, from the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. So we're looking at a combined potential up to $8 trillion of stimulus. And just to compare that with U.S. GDP, which is currently about $20 trillion, we're talking about 40% of U.S. GDP, which is staggering. So, just moving on here, it kind of gives a breakdown of what individuals received, right? So, the first check was a maximum of $1,200. The second check was $600. And the third check, the most recent one, was a maximum of $1,400 per individual. So we're looking at about $3,200 dollars in total check size per individual, and obviously that differs from depending on the income brackets. But when you kind of look at the American population right now, we're currently at 320 million folks. So about half of the American population, so approximately 160 million, received some form of government stimulus payments. And there's potential for a fourth and maybe even a fifth check to be coming down the road. So, that's kind of the magnitude from an individual level. Obviously, the stimulus has many different components, from state and to local governments, increased unemployment insurance, school funding, vaccines, and yeah, it's a big amount. So just wanted to delve into that more deeply, what the potential implications are for consumers and food retail. The third page kind of gives an outline. Many of you guys have seen the COVID infection rates since the beginning of the pandemic. Here in the U.S., it's looking likely, and that this, the pandemic is subsiding, and hopefully that will continue. On the bottom chart, you'll see the impact that the pandemic has had on jobs, right? So, if you kind of look at pre-pandemic, on any given month, you're looking at about 200,000 of net job gains. And what you see here, that huge bar down is kind of what the initial jobs impact. We're looking at 20 million jobs that were impacted. And so since the pandemic, there's been an economic recovery. It's been a net positive of 14 million jobs. I think what's important to remember is when you kind of look at the whole job situation as a whole, we're still net negative 8.4 million jobs. And when you kind of think about that, what does that mean? Many consumers are still hurting financially, right? Many consumers are still they're still looking for jobs, right? And so as a retail dietitian, I think it's important to realize that the financial situation, we're not in the clear yet. Consumers many are living paycheck to paycheck, and their ability to purchase food products is still severely impacted. But on the positive note, we're getting GDP growth. So the last figure last week was reported a GDP growth of 6.4%, and consumer personal consumption expenditures, right? So this is consumer spending, which kind of represents 2/3 of the U.S. economy, was at its second highest rate quarter to quarter since the 1960s. So that's a huge amount, right? And so it's positive. It's great. There was a lot of slack in the economy. Now that the economy is opening up, that restrictions are lifted, people are there to spend, and they're spending on everything, right? And so you kind of look at this chart here. What are they spending on, right? And these dark lines at the top, at the top graph, represent kind of the immediate impact of consumer spending based on the 3 stimulus checks that they received. So the first one was 23% here. The second was 22% back in December, and this latest round, the $1,400 checks, had an impact of 29% growth in spending. And so I think if you kind of look at the bottom graph here, you'll see what they've been spending. Initially, it was primarily on delivery. It was on online groceries. It was on online marketplaces, home improvement, and you'll see the progression of like how consumers have been spending. A lot of it has been on food, right? But consumers are spending on everything, right? It's not just food. And so what's been happening is that this spending, it's starting to creep up into the economy, right? And many of you already know, if you go to the local supermarket, prices are higher, right? Just this past week, I bought some Philadelphia cream cheese, at my local supermarket, and the prices were almost double than what they were last year. That's just one example, right? And so price inflation has been creeping up. Many of us already know that. But in the context of inflation as a whole, it still has been relatively muted so far, right? This chart here shows that inflation rates on the whole have remained anywhere from 2 to 3% historically, and I think what's really interesting here is that you look at food at home. So if you kind of look at the February towards the right hand of the graph, you'll see a spike there, and so kind of going forward, you'll see that it's not just food prices; it's everything, right? It's basic commodities: corn, wheat, soy, lean hogs. These are just four of the food commodities that we've seen. You look at the graph, you'll see a pretty dramatic rise in these basic food costs. And this, the rate of increase has, we're looking at levels that we haven't seen in quite some time in the US economy. And it's not just food, it's everything. Right? It's copper, it's aluminum, it's lumber. You look, if you were watching the news recently, there were a lot of reports on even lumber prices being almost double, even triple what they were, just a year ago, right? And so, my point in bringing up this topic of inflation, it's the main thing is that the stimulus and what we've gone through since the pandemic, it's caused the underlying drivers of inflation, and you guys all recall when I said at the very beginning, it's unprecedented, right? And I think one thing to recognize, when you kind of think about the pocketbooks of most consumers, they're being impacted, right? And so I just wanted to kind of on this page share what are the potential medium term and long term effects of this stimulus, right? My first point here in the near term, the stimulus has helped consumers get through a very difficult year. I do want to emphasize it's a short-term solution. It's transitory, right? And so everybody's happy when they get the stimulus check. It keeps them going for the next couple of months. But what's going to happen next, right? Will the economy improve to the level where they can get jobs, they can get stable jobs, and they're able to move forward that way? I did state that at the very beginning, job growth is improving. We're still net negative overall jobs, so approximately 8.4 million jobs. But the economic data shows an increase, right? GDP growth 6.4%, personal consumption growth 10.7%, and this demand as we move out of this pandemic. It's causing this supply demand imbalance, right? And that's why we're seeing the prices of our food commodities, food and beverage prices to rise, right? In the medium term, there will likely be some additional stimulus, as I mentioned, the American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan, which could be upwards of $4 trillion of additional stimulus. And one of my concerns, as a financial analyst, as someone who studies the food industry and food prices, what will that do to further inflame the economy with additional inflation? Right, the charts that we saw in corn and in wheat, lean hogs, and soy, is that the beginning? Right, it's not just the U.S., it's international as well. Right, so you have China, stockpiling. You have India and other countries also buying the same basic commodities, and so it's somewhat somewhat concerning that that what the price inflation that we've experienced over the past month it will likely continue, right? And so, for food, and being able to purchase healthy food, right? Fruits and vegetables, the supplements, food products that help consumers' overall health and wellness. These are things that will likely continue to rise in price, right? And so, it's something to keep in mind. Like, price volatility, I think, is here to stay. Again, this is my own personal opinion. If you definitely do your research and listen to other sort of economists and other financial analysts. But in my personal opinion, I think one of the key risks to consumers' pocketbook is this huge rise in inflation that will not only be sustained, but will likely get worse over the next 1, 2, 3, 5, and 10 years. In the long term, food inflation is a significant concern, and nobody likes to look out that far, 5 years, 10 years. But as advisors of as nutritionists, as dietitians who advise consumers and customers on their buying of healthy food, I think one of the things to keep in mind is how to think about advising consumers who are still financially not stable, where inflation is eating into their pocket. It's almost like another tax that they have to bear, right? How can consumers be able to get a well-balanced diet that is still affordable, right? This is one of the concerns that I think whether you're a parent or whether you're an individual, this is something that many folks, I believe, will be struggling with. Especially as we wait to see the effects of all the stimulus over the next 1 or 2 years. So this slide here really, this is the global picture of the pandemic, right? So the earlier picture was of the U.S. and things have come down. If you kind of look globally, we're still not out of the woods yet, right? And so India, many of you, if you're watching the news, India is in a state of crisis right now, right? With different variants of COVID impacting their economy, impacting people. And so, I think, what this quote by Thomas Frieden, who is the former director of the U.S. Centers of Disease Control, he had a pretty, he had a pretty impactful statement that he was quoted in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago. And then I'll just kind of read it here. Is it going through the 5 phases of grief? We don't need to come to the acceptance phase. We need to come to the acceptance phase that our lives are not going to be the same. I don't think the world has really absorbed the fact that these are long-term changes, right? So I think he's, as a scientist, he's probably kind of looking at things from a very kind of realistic, from an academic perspective, statistical perspective, even as a consumer myself, as an analyst, as an economist, as someone who studies the food industry, and just how economies affect the way people can purchase food. What that tells me is that we're not out of the woods yet, right? There's potential for additional variants of COVID to impact, not the global economy, but especially here in the U.S. as well. So, it all points to the fact that the financial impact of this COVID, it's likely not over. There can be further spikes in this over the next year or so, and that consumers will, may risk getting into further financial difficulties over the next year or so. So the stimulus has been good. It's helped us. It's helped most consumers and Americans to get by. But there's still a lot of work that needs to happen, for these consumers to get their stable jobs, to be able to afford healthy food and healthy beverages. And just one thing to keep in mind as we move into 2022 21 and 2022. This slide highlights the slow creep in inflation. I know, apologize for the small images and the small font here, but I'll kind of go through some of the inflation that we've seen over the past 6 months. Orange juice, it's up 1 or 2% from October of 2020 to last month, April 2021. Chicken and eggs, it's up 10%. Right, that's a big amount. Chicken breast is up 3%. Ground beef, fresh ground beef, it's up 3%. Bacon it's only up 2%. And the price of a bread is up 4%. Right, so it's the slow creep of this inflation that is concerning to me, right? And so one of the things I think, what I would advise all the retail dietitians here is, if there was a basket. So if you were to create different baskets of food, and let's say a person's budget for food is, let's say it's $100, for the week. How, as the prices go up, potentially up. I don't want to say this is definitive, but as we go through a period of inflation that might increase the price of basic food items quite substantially, how will that basket look change, right, as these prices rise? And so one of the things to think about is, let's say the price of fruits and vegetables goes up 10, 20, even 30% over the next year, hypothetically, right? I'm not saying this is definitive. I do want to emphasize that. What are some of the alternative ways that consumers can still get the nutrition that they need with some alternative forms of food and products, or even supplements, right? This is a key concern, I think. I don't think there's enough emphasis on, from the government. I don't think there's enough emphasis on media that focuses on this issue. And so, as advisors to your companies, as advisors to your clients, this is a key concern of theirs. And so it kind of forces all of us to kind of think of alternative ways to stretch that dollar and still get the nutrition that they need to live healthy lives. So moving on to this next slide, I kind of like this slide because as someone who who's the managing partner of a food media company, I listen to a lot of folks. I watch a lot of presentations. I read a lot of sort of research reports from various stakeholders of the economy, right? So on the left, on the one hand, if you watched Jerome Powell, who's a current Fed chairman, and also Janet Yellen, who was his predecessor and is the current U.S. Treasury Secretary. If you listen to their speech right now, they're saying all this inflation is transitory. Right, it's it'll go back down. There'll be they say that there'll be a small blip as the demand for food products goes up, and just products in general, right? But that it'll go down. On the flip side, when you listen to some of these financial billionaires. So I'm talking the folks on the right. On the top is David Einhorn of Greenlight Capital. He made his fortune during the great financial crisis of 2008 when he shorted housing and kind of these derivative securities. You have Ray Dalio, who's also a billionaire, running Bridgewater hedge fund, and Michael Burry. Many of you have probably seen the movie The Big Short. So he is the hedge fund manager used to be at Scion Capital Management that also shorted mortgage-backed securities and derivative sort of securities that were backed by housing back in 2008, 2009. The this group of financial investors are predicting not just inflation, but significant inflation, and in some cases, hyperinflation over the next 5 and 10 years. Media doesn't like to cover them because nobody wants to hear that there's inflation or the risk of inflation, right? But they are preparing their portfolios for inflation and significant inflation. So who's right? Who are you going to believe, right? That's for this, you all to think about, right? And for me, I'm not beholden to any sort of investor or hedge fund. There's no conflict of interest on my side. I look at the data, I do the research, I report on things, right? And as a objective observer of what's happening in the U.S. economy and all this record amounts of staggering stimulus, there will be negative externalities in my opinion, right? And whether that happens this year, next year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, I do think that we're not out of the woods, and I do think that all the financial engineering that the U.S. The government officials are doing, I don't think in the long run it's going to be all rosy as they make it seem to be, right? And so just some food for thought for the group here. 3 charts I want to kind of highlight. We're at a federal debt as a percentage of GDP over 100% right now. You kind of look at this on the left chart. That's staggering. And not only that, the Federal Reserve balance sheet is going to reach 10 trillion projected this year, which is unprecedented in U.S. history. So you have rising levels of debt. The second, you have rising levels of M2 money supply, right? And I don't want to get into the kind of the economic intricacies of this, but what it means is when there's increase of money supply and surges in money supply and the velocity of money, so basically people spending money in the economy and the government printing money, it lends itself to potential risk of inflation. On the right chart, you'll see that currently, because of the stimulus, consumers, the stimulus checks are representing 30% of their income. Just think about that. The government is one of the primary providers of capital to consumers. It just boggles my mind to see how much stimulus we've reached. But lastly, and this is food for thought. It's only a minute left. Michael Burry, as I mentioned, he was the hedge fund manager at Zion Capital. What he said was quite staggering. This was back in February of this year. He likened the current state of the U.S. economy to what Weimar Germany was back in the 1918 during the First World War. And during that time, the German economy experienced hyperinflation. And the value of the German mark went from 1, which you see on the right-hand chart, to almost worthless. So the fact that it's appreciating that much, it means that the value of that mark is going down, down, and down. It's to almost to the point where it was worthless over a period of 5 years. So I just want to kind of put all this stimulus that we've seen into context, and it's not to frighten you all. It's not to be doom and gloom, but it's to be aware that the current financial situation right now it's precarious. That the risk of inflation is high, and the potential for hyperinflation is also greater than 0. Okay, so and there's not much coverage in the media about that. So kind of my key takeaways from this, and this is for all of you who are advising clients as retail dietitians. Be aware of inflation as it impacts your clients, right? And so one of my advice to you all is to think of alternative ways. Once, if prices go out of whack, how will you advise your clients to get, a balanced, nutritious meal to provide for their families, and to do it within the budget that they're able to purchase these products, right? So that's number one. Number two is just, to, as consumers start to ask you questions like, why are the prices of apples going up 30%, right? Or is to have that that understanding of fundamentals in economic and monetary and fiscal policy, right? To put it in context, right? And so it's, part of me presenting this to you all is so that you all could be better educated of what's happening in the U.S. economy right now, right? This is not about being a Republican or being pro-Democrat. This is about sound economic, fiscal, and monetary policy. And we're at the current stage where we have an administration that is so focused on stimulus, they're not looking at the long-term implications of what that will mean to the U.S. economy and inflation as a whole. So with that, I apologize. I went over 2 minutes, and I'll pause for any questions. So, are there any questions from the, feel free to send in your questions to the chat. If you'd like to come on video, I think there's a button where you guys can come on and ask your questions. So please let me know if you guys would like to chat, or if not, you guys can reach me. Happy to discuss this more. I do think it's an important topic, and hopefully this was educational, but also eye-opening as to kind of the risks that are still existent in the U.S. economy. So there's a great question by Susan Lang. So how does this compare to FDR's New Deal, corrected for inflation since then? So, but basically what happened is, I kind of want to put this in context, looking at for the past 3 decades. So back in the 1980s, U.S. inflation reached almost 20% back then, right? So during the 70s, you had a tremendous amount of spending, similar to what we've been experiencing. A lot of printing money, moving it into the economy. And so inflation went all the way up to 20%. So then you had Paul Volcker, who was the Federal Reserve Chairman at the time. He brought up short-term interest rates, basically stopping the economy, right? And since then, since the 1980s, you've seen a slow decline in interest rates up until today, which is basically, it's free money, right? 30-year government treasuries, are 2-3%. Short-term interest rates are almost zero. So this is what we're seeing. What happened in the 1970s, right? And it's the impact that loose monetary policy and loose fiscal policy will have on an economy. And so, I fear that, and again, this is not me bashing kind of Democrats. I think any president, I think even if it was a Republican in the White House right now, I think they'd still be printing money and stimulating the economy, right? So we have a very pro-stimulus government right now, and the additional $4 trillion in stimulus, I fear that it's gonna be more detrimental. I do think to the economy. I do think we'll see prices rise, substantially.